There, in NLP and the people who are the sort of the NLP Illuminati, I'm not sure exactly who they are, but the people who are putting themselves out there and other hangers-on of the Illuminati seem to invoke the unconscious mind. There's a great deal of invocation, and then the minute some of the sharper elements in their classes start asking them what they mean by the term the unconscious mind, they immediately retreat into this kind of evasive, slippery rationalization, define it out of existence. Well, there really isn't an unconscious mind. Okay, wrong. There is an unconscious mind. And the NLP community does not have a very strong grasp of this, because the NLP community does not have a very strong grasp of neuroscience. And there's a lot of neuroscience going on that's completely moving in and across the territory that NLP has claimed for itself. Yes, I think we can legitimately talk about the unconscious mind as a phenomenal entity. And it's very important to make a distinction between, a thing, a nominalized thing, and a phenomenal entity, something that has a form of existence that is not necessarily an objectified, physicalized form, but it may. And philosophy, especially phenomenology, has given us much, much subtler distinctions between, say, actuality and potentiality, far finer than, say, nominalization and denominalization. This whole nominalization, denominalization thing is, in some ways, kind of pre-phenomenological. It's kind of like working with 19th century hand tools, claiming you're building, state-of-the-art circuitry or something. There's more has gone on in the meantime. So there was an article in Scientific American about 9 months ago that did describe the important differences between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and how these had an evolutionary base. And one of the important differences, and there apparently are very significant differences between the left and the right hemispheres. And yes, in some ways the brain can phenomenologically or phenomenally we can talk about left versus right hemisphere functions. And then there's a bunch of people that don't want to talk about that. That's been overturned. Well, no, it hasn't been overturned. And if you think so, you don't know what you're talking about. So go read your neuroscience. How about it? And then come back, if that motivates you. The left hemisphere in the normally organized brain is a linguistic hemisphere. It contains Broca's area and a number of other sub-speech centers. But the main idea, I think, is that the top-down, going from abstraction to the concrete, is occurring in the left hemisphere, and the bottom-up processing are going from the sensory-specific, or what we would call the percepts here, into and going up toward forming abstraction occurs more in the right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere tends to be more of a labeling top-down, and the right hemisphere tends to be more of a perceiving and then sending information up to the labeling or the abstraction, identifying through abstraction process. And there's a great deal of communication taking place across the three major commissures, the corpus callosum, the anterior commissure, and the posterior commissure. And it has to squeeze through a little tiny area in the corpus callosum called the splenium, or the knee. And that's bigger in women, and probably, if we exercise our NLP a lot, it's probably bigger in NLP persons. But needless to say, it certainly appears to me that the DHE processes and those where we are remapping and relabeling using mapping from the top is going to be coming in through the left hemisphere, where the Grinderian stuff, or the sort of pre-linguistic, or as John used to call it, the tyranny of the left hemisphere, is overridden, and we're working in the right hemisphere, is going to be more of a right hemisphere process. Okay, now this is confounded by one other point that simply is not raised in NLP. NLP is completely silent on this subject, unfortunately. And once again, this is why, if you're teaching it or you're talking it, you better go learn some neuroscience. And if you're not willing to do that, just, stop pretending, okay? It's intellectually embarrassing. It really is. And that's one of the reasons NLP does have this kind of tendency to go into laughingstock territory when the philosophers pick it up or the neuroscientists pick it up, because they're making claims without grounding them in what's known right now, in functional knowledge. So there's this area in the back of your brain that contains about half the neuronal density, or 50 billion neurons, but organized somewhat differently, called the cerebellum. Cerebellum is an ipsilateral structure. The cerebrum is a contralateral structure. And the cerebellum is very much involved in motor coordination, but it's also very, very much involved in the coordination of ideas and thoughts. People with bad cerebellums, cerebellar strokes or injuries or infections sometimes develop all kinds of bizarre inabilities to actually coordinate their thinking, a dysmetria of thought. So there's another way of looking at the unconscious mind, can also be the very basic coordinating processes, almost a parallel consciousness or a parallel self that's embodied in a physical structure in the back of your head there. This got half the neurons in your brain, and it's got a 3-layer cortex versus the cerebrum that has a 6-layer cortex, etc. So what we're really talking about is, yes, there are probably physical areas of the brain that are, quote, the unconscious mind in many ways. There are probably phenomenal processes that take place. And I would say that probably the unconscious mind, if we want to talk about it in a first cut kind of reasonable clarification, finding an ordering principle here is the unconscious mind is those parts of the mind that are not currently feeding information into Broca's area, the speech area, and not giving semantic or symbolic representation, which may then feed back to, say, the visual area, or maybe go straight to the visual area, maybe give you pictures, symbols, words, etc. So yeah, there's an unconscious mind. NLP people, there is an unconscious mind. It's more like there are a number of possible configurations outside of what we would call conscious awareness that start from very, very simple processes and work their way up to much more abstract and complex processes, some of which are going to be fed into semantic and symbolic representations, and others that are going to remain outside of that. More on that.